Oh, triggers. Everyone's favorite thing in Vanguard. We are going to be talking about it once again. And we've talked about the OT a few times, but today we're going to talk about triggers in general. And a few things that have been expressed in the community recently, and a few things that I've been discussing with some of my friends here in Japan as well, regarding how impactful triggers have been in Standard. So, of course, in Standard, unlike the trigger power change happened in V format where they became 10k power in addition. But then when we got into the D series, the shield power decreased, but the fighting, the attack power did not decrease. And that was kind of weird. People didn't really like that from the very beginning, but the overall attack power level of early Standard wasn't super crazy to the point that that would be a problem, so it's kind of okay. And then nowadays, people have been saying it's like, damn, it feels like if my opponent checks triggers, then I lose. And if I sack a bit, then I win. Like, all it takes is a couple lucky swings, and that's usually where it ends. And well, it wasn't just us feeling this in locals recently, but also world champion of the premium format, Musrax, also known as Dave Vecht, expressed some thoughts that I think would be pretty good to look at on stream as well and discuss a little bit. So, Dave wrote a little thread, and I think it's good if we give it a read and discuss it a little bit as well. So, Dave says, while playtesting Standard in preparation for BRO, I felt like triggers impact the game more than that in the first few sets of Standard. While triggers impact the game in all formats, it has become extremely toxic in Standard due to how aggressive decks are on grade 3. We'll talk about this, specifically this, in a bit. Of course, we all have the funny overtrigger, but that's not specifically what I want to address, and we've all expressed this thought already, get that out of the way. But the issue right now is that if my opponent hits 1 or 2 unlucky triggers, I'm almost guaranteed to lose, and if I hit 1 or 2 well-timed triggers, I'm almost guaranteed to win. Alright? Some people have definitely felt this recently too, with the more aggressive decks popping up. Standard has so little shield in comparison to V and P that every aggro/explosive deck can sometimes win based on how much more triggers I've seen than you, regardless of which deck you play. So, we'll talk about, again, aggro-explosive decks. I think he highlights a very important point here, and that's kind of where my little argument here is going to come up as well. But he says, while a gap between a tier 1 and tier 2 deck exists, it's all in context of what the deck naturally does. And I'm not asking that the better player should always win, because otherwise I would play chess, right? People like to say this argument. It's like, oh, you don't like luck mechanics? We'll just play chess. It's like, nobody wants to play chess, want to play cards. In early D series, triggers still impacted the format heavily, but because all the decks hit for shit numbers, you could get away by dropping 2 5k shields and a trigger to block an attack. Now numbers increase insanely high, and hitting a crit feels much more powerful based on that, because, you're adding an extra damage to that huge number as well. The problem with the D format is that the power creep increments due to power creep versus the increments of draw power don't line up at all. Drawing a bunch of 5k shield isn't going to help you when the minimum attack is 33k most of the time, and so you are more reliant on seeing triggers. Now, and also another interesting thing, I'll just bring this up already, is that sometimes you'll be playing decks that compress very heavily, like that are also aggressive, like Willista, where you're like, damn, I want to draw cards because drawing cards is good, but if I draw my triggers, that means my numbers will be less impactful. So it's like, do I really want to draw more cards if I draw my triggers? But anyway, since they are both 10k additional power, which your opponent has trouble dealing with, plus the only real shield value you have in your deck, so referring to triggers, you can counter your opponent's triggers hopefully more. Tiers in D series have far less value than V and P, where the RNG is far lower. So of course V doesn't have the OT as well, so that's another thing. Due to how technical premium can sometimes be, the better player mostly wins even when the worst player hits the OT sometimes. And V has come to the point where triggers don't really matter, or don't change the outcome due to how much shield and draw power the format has. This was end of G, by the way, as well, was the exact same argument. So this is the thread, and I think there's a lot of really interesting points that are pointed out in here. Just kind of talking about how strong triggers have become, but also just how the power increment, I think power creep in Standard itself has been at a very good pace, because it feels like decks stay relevant for a very long time, right? So the actual increment of power in Standard has been at a very nice pace to keep decks even from a year ago still be relevant to this day. But the defensive creep has not been good enough. The defensive creep has been lacking, and at this point it feels like it's hard to think what can they even do with it, right? Earlier in this stream we were actually talking about, I was saying the way that they've been printing crests for like a bunch of different decks, at this point they could just print a grade 1 that, or like new starters or something, or I guess just like some card that you can play in your deck generically that makes a crest that all it does is give plus 5k shield to every single card in your hand or in your deck or whatever, right? Just to add more defensive options. And that's also why Eva was so good for so long, is because it has more defensive options than any other deck. Now, I think Dave points out something very important in this whole thing, which is about aggressive decks on grade 3. Now, and this is where this coincides with the discussion that I've been having with some of the players here in Japan, is that for the last year or so, until a few months ago, let's say, the standard meta has actually been pretty slow. A lot of grindy and slower decks were actually at the top of the meta until I would say set 10-ish. And set 10 is where we saw this kind of like increment. We saw Gandiva, we saw mask decks that suddenly persona right on turn 3 if they go second. And overall, the power increment went up a notch. And because of that, it's not necessarily like that the game became less fun to play or anything, but it became more trigger reliant, because if your opponent has a big grade 3 turn with that much power, the way to survive it is to hit a defensive. And then in response, if your opponent hits more triggers while doing that kind of aggressive grade 3, then they're gonna widen that gap too. Then Willista was introduced, which has an incredible early game where you can push your opponent to 4. Like if you hit one lucky trigger, your opponent's at 4 before they ride grade 3, right? It's pretty crazy. And then you don't stop that momentum on your turn 3 either, because of how many tools Willista has as well. And so because of that, triggers become more impactful, because now hitting a defensive means that it's not that the attacks are shut down, it's that you can guard them, whereas otherwise you wouldn't have been able to guard them, right? That's kind of where that thing comes from. Whereas until that point, I feel like we were actually in a fairly slowish meta as well. Jet, everyone likes to complain about, but Jet took a while to get into those really unstoppable turns, where some of the more recent decks, like Minerva and Willista and Gandiva, start to feel unstoppable by turn 4, whereas Jet, especially going first, wouldn't really be unstoppable until like turn 5. And Eva is kind of the same. Eva has no early game. She used to with Combined Rusher, I guess in English you still do, but Eva was a slow deck. It kind of had a relatively okay turn 3, and then it started popping off in turn 4, and then it kind of keeps on snowballing. And a lot of decks were like that. I feel like the meta was kind of like that, where games were fairly long, we'd use up the entire 25-minute time limit of a round, and overall the game was just a bit slower. Whereas now, we have a lot of these decks that are just a lot more aggressive, and as you said, a lot more explosive, that because the game has sped up, the power of triggers has become so much more important. Because now, hitting a trigger early can completely change the whole pacing of the game. And I also enjoy slower metas too. There's also a slower meta means more turns are played, which means more decisions are made, which means the better player who makes the better decisions will usually win. And a faster meta just kind of favors sacking, like it just favors the luckier player basically rather than the more skilled player. And I think that that's not necessarily a great thing. And I think that when a meta speeds up, it should be paired with more defensive options. And I just wish, I don't know how to say this anymore, but I just want Bouchard to explore more defensive options at this point, because that's what we need to correspond to this. Like, when you play Minerva, you'll see, when you play set 11 Minerva with the Seisas promo, the way to stop that deck is hitting defensives. Like, otherwise it's just, it's rough. You are eating 8 attacks in one turn, and they're asking for minimum 15k shield every single attack. So if you don't want to be giving up 15k shield, you need a defensive to make those into 5k shields, and it's still going to be pretty high. And then if they don't persona ride, well, one defensive shuts down their whole turn, and then it feels sacky, right? So I really want them to make more defensive cards that are good. Like, they made those generics recently, the triple rare generics in set 12, that both do something and also get a bunch of shield on Guardian Circle. Good. Do more of that. Do more cards that do something in the game when played during your turn, but also do stuff when played defensively. I like that, and we need more of those. If they're not willing to just straight up make G-guards again that were like a outside of deck defensive mechanic, then either make a defensive crest that just gives more shield power to everything, or just keep exploring more defensive options that also generate some form of card advantage. Because card advantage paired with better defensive cards means that drawing cards from effects means I'm not just drawing into random 5k shields that are like useless when I'm defending against my opponent. I'm drawing into cards that will be also have utility during my turn, but also have ways to block attacks on my opponents. If I draw into a normal card that, let's say, countercharges one or draws me a card or something, but is also 20k shield, I like that. So I feel like that might be one of the ways to solve this kind of issue that's creeping up right now. I don't think it's a huge issue, but you know, I think we have Dave actually in chat under the name Musrax there, and he says, Bushi has always been late with making defensive creep cards like Heal Guardians. Those were also far late in the V era, while we already had OTK decks when XL2 came out. And yeah, that is correct. I just don't want to have an XL2 situation right now. If we could be printing better blitz orders, if we could be printing better cards that just have more shield while having utility as well. So I think it would be very nice, and I hope that Bushiroad is exploring that in the future. Obviously, cards and sets are designed like a year in advance, so what I'm saying right now, even if it does have an impact, it'll have an impact in a year's time, right? So we're gonna have to see how things pace out. But for the time being, you know, we're seeing some interesting space being explored, and you know, them making things like the new Cat Dark States deck that nullifies your opponent's defensive triggers. But we're gonna have to start doing that to every single deck if they want to make it uniform. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. I think this is an interesting discussion to be had. It's definitely an interesting trend in recent Vanguard card design as well. And hopefully we see where it's going to go in the future, because I think a lot of us like defensive plays and defensive creep, and hopefully we see some cool things from Bushiroad coming up, especially, you know, with how cool the anime has been, and just in general how cool the game has felt to play overall in general lately. We just need a bit more defensive plays if the meta is going to speed up. I think a faster meta should be met with more defensive options. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, if you haven't subscribed already, please do so. If you haven't liked the video yet, what are you waiting for? And if you want to support the channel any other way, please make sure to become a YouTube channel member if you want to. There's some bonus content. You want to see how fast decks are played? I made a Minerva video on playing it in first-person perspective, where I walk you through everything you need to know in the set 11 format, so you can check that out as a YouTube channel member. But otherwise, you can check out all my socials and all that bonus stuff in the description below. And that's gonna be it for this video. Let me know your thoughts once again in the comments below, and otherwise I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.